Welcome, everyone. Thank you. And big thank you to Mrs. Black for opening your home and hosting. Tanya's here tonight. Tanya maybe is a mystery to some of us, maybe is not a mystery, maybe is both a mystery and not a mystery to all of us. Some people I know here have learned of Tanya before. Some people maybe have not. So the goal for tonight is to give some type of overview / introduction, more on the introduction than the overview, in the hopes that the introduction will pique your curiosity if you have not yet learned Tanya. And if you have learned Tanya, I hope that the introduction that I'm going to offer will increase your curiosity to learn Tanya even more and to learn Tanya deeper and to invest time and thought in your mind and your heart to learn Tanya, which I think is very much worthwhile. And I've never met a single person who spent time learning Tanya and said, wasn't really worth it. I could have spent my time doing something better. I never met anybody like that. So I very much encourage and with confidence that if you do spend time learning Tanya, do invest in learning some Tanya, I think you'll appreciate it and enjoy it. So that being said, so we'll have a little introduction to the Tanya. What is the Tanya? We'll try to talk tonight a little bit about what is the Tanya, and we'll discuss some of the ideas in the Tanya. Again, there's no way we can cover all the Tanya, that's for sure. So I'm going to try to give a little bit of an introduction to what it is and why Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi wrote it. Why did he take the time out of his busy schedule to write the Tanya? I'm sure he could have done a lot of other things, but instead he wrote the Tanya, wrote a lot of books. So we'll take a step back a little bit before the Alter Rebbe. I'll call him the Alter Rebbe. That's in Chabad, how we refer to Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi. Outside of Chabad, when I moved to Queens, I found out that people don't call him the Alter Rebbe, and I was very shocked. They call him the Baal HaTanya, the author of the Tanya. Interestingly, often when the Lubavitcher Rebbe would quote or refer to the Baal HaTanya, he called him the Baal HaTanya v'ha Shulchan Aruch, the author of the Tanya and the Shulchan Aruch, because the Alter Rebbe, when he was in his 20s, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, when he was in his 20s, he was tasked by his Rebbe, the Mezritcher Maggid, who was the main disciple of the Baal Shem Tov. He was tasked with writing a, if you will, current version of the Shulchan Aruch, which became, because he was very, very organized, and he was very good at putting things into their proper place. He was great at systems, as we'll see in the Tanya as well. So the Mezritcher Maggid asked him to please write a Shulchan Aruch, which became known as the Shulchan Aruch Harav, or in Chabad, we call it the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch. So even though we're in Queens, and people in Queens call Rabbi Shneur Zalman the Baal HaTanya, but for me, it's hard to say that. I just call him the Alter Rebbe. So that's what we're going to go with. The Alter Rebbe is Yiddish. It means the old rabbi, the Alter Rebbe. So before the Alter Rebbe, his Rebbe was the Mezritcher Maggid, Reb Dov Ber of Mezritch. His Rebbe was the Baal Shem Tov, Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov. Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov came to the world something like 300 years ago and made a total revolution that spread across the entire Jewish world. It took time before it took hold, but now we for sure feel the influence of the Baal Shem Tov almost everywhere. One of the Baal Shem Tov's main teachings, so one of the things he emphasized, was a teaching in the Zohar. The Zohar says many things. The Zohar says, Rachmona liba boi, which means Rachmona, the merciful one, meaning Hashem, liba boi, he wants your heart. Hashem wants your heart. He doesn't want you to act by rote. He doesn't want us to just do the mitzvahs, chick-chack, okay, I did it, checklist. No, that's not what Hashem wants. He wants your heart. That was the Baal Shem Tov. And he went all over traveling and spreading these teachings in his unique, inimitable way. His disciple was the Mezritcher Maggid, who in turn had something like 60 Talmidim. Each of those 60, some of them you've heard of Nachman of Breslov, Nachman of Chernobyl. These were some of the Lev Yitzchak Barditchev, Zushav Anapoli, Elimelech Lezhinsk, the great, great tzaddikim. The Alter Rebbe was one of those 60 Talmidim. They were all trying to figure out, how do we serve Hashem with our heart? How do we put everything into it? We want to do that. You don't have to convince us, but how? How can we get to the heart? How can we truly serve Hashem with passion and excitement? How do we make it personal? So there were different approaches, and they were all holy and they were all great. Of those 60 Talmidim, the Alter Rebbe's approach was different than everyone else. It was unique. And it became known later as Chabad, Chassidus Chabad. What's Chabad? Chabad stands for Chochma, Bina, and Das, which we're not going to discuss so much tonight what that means. In the Tanya, he will discuss it at length. Chabad basically means, for in short term, your intellect. Why is it called Chassidus Chabad? Because the Alter Rebbe says, since we know, based on the teachings of the Zohar, as emphasized by the great Baal Shem Tov, we know that Hashem wants our heart. He wants us to serve him with our full heart. But how do you get there? So said the Alter Rebbe, well, it's actually very simple. You see, if you know a little bit of Kabbalah, which Tanya is not Kabbalah, although it uses heavily Kabbalistic ideas, but it's not Kabbalah. If you know a little bit of Kabbalah, you'll know that there is a system within man and woman, which we'll discuss a little bit tonight. And that system says that the intellect affects the emotions. Your mind, when you stand up, your head is above your heart. Your head, your emotion, your intellect, so to speak, is meant to flow down and affect your heart, translate into emotions. So said the Alter Rebbe, my approach, which he later wrote in the Tanya, we'll get to that soon, is that if you want to serve Hashem with your heart, you actually have to start up here. You have to start in your head. We have to start with contemplation about Hashem, awareness about Hashem. You can't love someone that you don't know. So if you want to love Hashem, that's going to be really hard to do if you never spent a minute thinking about who Hashem is. So the Alter Rebbe was going to provide all sorts of contemplations and ideas and so forth for us to get to know Hashem intellectually. And little by little, that's going to trickle down and change our hearts, affect our emotions, and help us serve Hashem with our hearts. So that's the Alter Rebbe, basically. That's the Alter Rebbe's approach. So he wrote a Shulchan Aruch, the Shulchan Aruch, which was very masuder, very organized. And he also wrote a Tanya. The Tanya was also very organized. So, which by the way fits his name. His name was Shneir. Shneir Zalman. Shneir is Shnei Or, two lights. The light of the revealed Torah, that is Halacha and Gemara, and the light of the hidden Torah, that is the light of Kabbalah and Chassidus. That's his name. So his name fit who he was. Now, why did the Alter Rebbe write the Tanya? So what was happening was that Chassidus was spreading like wildfire across Russia and Europe. And there was a lot of opposition to it. They called themselves the Misnagdim. There was a lot of opposition to Chassidus, but it was catching like wildfire. And people started flocking to the Mizrachi Maggid, and they were flocking to all of the Mizrachi Maggid's Talmidim, Nachman of Breslov, we mentioned many of them before, Reb Levi Yitzchak Berditchev, and the Alter Rebbe. People were flocking to them to see, what does it mean? How do we connect to Hashem? So many, many people came to the Alter Rebbe with their questions. They had all sorts of questions about Emunah, Bitochen, Tefillah, Torah, Mitzvahs, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. What do all these things mean? And these were, by the way, these were people that were, but for the most part, tremendous Talmidei Chachamim, people that were Baki B'Shas, people that were keeping every Allah and Shulchan Aruch to the T. These were not people that were seemingly lacking in their spiritual life, yet they felt a lack. They felt that even though I'm doing everything, but I'm doing nothing. I haven't moved. Nothing's happened. So they came to the Alter Rebbe and the other great tzaddikim. They came to the Alter Rebbe and they asked him questions in Avodas Hashem, and he answered. People would have a yechidus. They would have a private audience. They would get to talk to the Alter Rebbe and say, Rebbe, this is my problem that I'm struggling with. This is my issue. I'm blocked. I have this problem, that problem, whatever the issues were. And the Alter Rebbe would tell them what to do and how to do it. So the Alter Rebbe could have continued like that, but he didn't. And we don't have to guess why. We could read the Tanya because he tells us why he wrote the Tanya. So in the introduction, He says two things. First of all, and we mentioned that maybe there's not going to be a sheer reading so much inside, but oisios machkimois, to see the actual words and to read the actual words, which the Alter Rebbe worked for 20 years on the words of the Tanya, 20 years. And the story is told that before there was one specific instance that's mentioned in the traditions that he wasn't sure should he add the letter vav before a certain word, meaning and. And before he decided whether he should add the letter vav, which would just mean the word and, he reviewed in his mind the entire Tanya first to see what would that one letter do to the rest of the Tanya. So everything is extremely precise in the Tanya. So we'll read a little bit from the introduction. And this is going to explain to us in the author's own words why he wrote the Tanya. He could have just, again, everybody's coming to you anyway, asking for advice. No, so continue. What's wrong with that? So he says as follows. There's not enough time. There's too many of you. There's so many questions, so many people. There's still only 24 hours in the day. I don't have time to answer each of you individually. There's not time in the day. Number one. And number two, and also, you're very forgetful. A lot of the questions are repeat questions. Like you keep asking the same thing year after year. So I'm answering the same thing over and over again. Or alternatively, I told you a certain teaching when we were meeting personally, but maybe you didn't fully understand it. So you went home to wherever you live to try to integrate that teaching, but there's so much depth in the teaching that while you were trying to integrate it and trying to figure it out, you forgot half of what I told you anyway. No fault of your own. That's just what happens. So for these two reasons, number one, there's not enough time in the day to address everyone's questions. And number two, people are forgetful. Therefore, he continues, Al Kain, Rashamti kol hatshuvois al kol hashaylos. I wrote down all the answers to all the questions. That's what it says on the flyer. I didn't make that up. The Alter Rebbe says that himself. I wrote down all the answers to all the questions. L'mishmeres lois. You should have this. You can preserve it. Here's the book. This has all the answers to all the questions. Take this book. You'll have it. And now, if you ever have a question, you can just look inside here and you'll have the answer. Easy, right? You could have it as a remembrance between your eyes. It's something to remember. You will no longer have to push your way in to get a private meeting with me. You won't have to do that anymore because whatever you need is in here anyway. In the words of the Tanya, this book right here, you will find calm for your soul, and good advice for anything that's difficult, anything that's challenging to you in Avodas Hashem. That's what he says. All the answers to all the questions. It's a bold claim, yet he makes it. It's a bold claim. Not only is it a bold claim, but if you open the Tanya and actually read it a little bit, you'll find that it's not even written as answers to questions. There's not really any questions in here. And there's a lot of detailed questions. But if you want to know, let's say you struggle with anger, let's say. A person struggles with anger. They want to know, what do I do about my anger? I don't know. There's no chapter that deals with anger in the Tanya. Person says, I'm very arrogant. Where do I find the chapter that deals with arrogance? How do I deal with that? Well, there's no chapter that deals with arrogance in the Tanya. Unlike many other great works of Musar and other great works, for example, you will find a chapter on anger, a chapter on pride, a chapter on arrogance, whatever it may be, but not really in the Tanya. So what we see from these words of the Alter Rebbe in the introduction here is really what should be our perspective when we open the Tanya. And the perspective is that it's not a book. It's not a book. I know it looks like a book, but it's not. It's Yechidus with the Alter Rebbe. It's a one-on-one meeting with the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe tells us himself, you used to come and talk to me face to face. Now instead of that, here. I'm here. So reading the Tanya is not reading a book. It's meeting face to face with the Alter Rebbe, who's going to talk to you personally, intimately, privately about what matters in your life. And it's all in the Tanya, all the answers to all the questions. Because it's not a book. If it's a book, you see it's not so big. How could it possibly contain all the answers? It obviously can't. There's no way that any one book or any multiple books could possibly contain all the answers to all the questions. So obviously he doesn't mean that if I look up what is 3 plus 3, the answer is going to say, it doesn't say that in here. There's no way it contains all the answers to all the questions if it's a book. But it's not a book. It's a yechidus. It's a one-on-one, face-to-face meeting with the Alter Rebbe himself, and he's going to address your challenges, just as he did in Russia before he wrote the Tanya, when Chassidim came to him with their problems, and who knows what kind of problems a Rebbe deals with. Some were maybe what we would say, what's the big deal? So you couldn't figure out the Gemara? Okay, so just figure it out. Other people maybe had devastating life issues and everything in between. So Tanya, again, is not so much a book, but it's more sensitive answers to people's personal and private questions. But that being said, how does he make this bold claim, all the answers to all the questions? Even if we don't understand it to mean literally every question that would ever be asked in humanity, but he does say it. He does say all the answers to all the questions. What does he mean? So I think perhaps what he means is as follows. By the way, if there's questions come up, or if I say something that doesn't make sense, or if you have questions as we go, please feel free to interject, either before, during, after, etc. So the real topic of the Tanya is your neshama, is your soul. And in the Tanya, he's going to explain to us, what is my spiritual makeup? What is the spiritual makeup of a Jew? What does it mean to be a Jew? What does it mean to be a human being? What is a mitzvah? What does it mean to learn Torah? Who is Hashem? What happens when I do a mitzvah? What is my purpose on planet Earth? Why was I born? These are the issues that are dealt with in the Tanya. And the way that Alter Rebbe addresses them, which we're going to get to soon, is by giving us a picture of who we are, of what is our spiritual makeup. And if you know who you are, you will be able to find all the answers to all the questions, because they're already inside you. You're not going to find them in a book. You're going to find them inside yourself. That's where the answers really are, if you know who you are, if you know what you're really about. You'll be able to address any question that comes up in your life if you actually know who you are, if you're in tune and in touch with your spiritual makeup, which is what the Tanya is all about. There was, I read a story, Tzvi Hirsch Weinreb from the OU, pretty well known. I think he was a rabbi and a doctor, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, right? And he's not a Lubavitcher, although he did apparently grow up in Crown Heights. But he really has, to my knowledge, no real connection to Chabad, no family connection or anybody. He grew up in Crown Heights, and in the old days, I think there were many non-Chabad families in Crown Heights. Now there are not, but there were at one time. At some point, he had moved to Maryland, and I think he was working in psychiatry or psychology, as well as giving a couple Gemara shiurim as well, which he loved. He gave more of an introductory Gemara shir as well as an in-depth Gemara shir. He was very talented at it, had a geshmak in doing that, but he also was very interested in psychology and felt that that's a way to help people, and so on and so forth. So it was fine for a while. I think he was in his 30s. But at some point he felt there was a crossroads. He has to choose. Am I going to go just for Torah and teach Gemara, teach Torah? That's going to be my path in life. Or maybe to psychology. What should be my path in life? And he really wasn't sure. And he felt very troubled and unsure how to make the decision. So he did what anyone smart does. Asked some friends for advice. Hey, what should I do? This is my problems, my issues. What should I do? Spoke to his chaverim, spoke to his friends. One person told him, why don't you ask the Lubavitcher Rebbe? Okay. He didn't really feel necessarily a connection to the Rebbe, but why not? What do you got to lose? So he picked up the phone and he called the office at 770 Eastern Parkway. And one of the Rebbe's secretaries answered the phone. Said, I'd like to speak to the Rebbe. Okay, I'm not just going to put the Rebbe on the phone, but like, what do you need? So he starts explaining that he's at a crossroads. He has to choose, and he's not sure how to choose. He needs advice. He needs guidance. And he hears in the background someone in Yiddish speaking to the secretary on the phone. He recognizes the voice. He'd been to a Fabrengen before. So he understood it was the Rebbe speaking. The Rebbe is asking, who is it? Who's on the phone? So Rabbi Weinreb says, a Yid from Maryland. A Jew from Maryland is on the phone. That's how he identified himself. So he continues telling the story, and the secretary is kind of paraphrasing and translating into Yiddish for the Rebbe. I don't know why the Rebbe understood English, but that's the story I read. And the Rebbe is responding. So he listens and he lays out his issue, his challenges, and how to make the decision and so forth. And he hears in the background the Rebbe again saying that tell him, and he says to the secretary, tell the guy on the phone that there's someone in Maryland he can speak to with his problems, and there Id Heist Weinreb. And the Jew who we can speak to is named Weinreb. So the secretary, silence. That's me. Silence. So the secretary says, did you hear what the Rebbe said in the background? So Rabbi Weinreb says, no, I didn't hear. He heard. He said, no, I didn't hear. So he says, Sizda Yid in Maryland. So the secretary repeats that. He says, there's a Jew in Maryland. There's a Jew in Maryland with whom he should speak. Sein Nomen is Weinreb, and his name is Weinreb. That's him. So Weinreb is astonished. So he says to the secretary, no, I'm Weinreb. That's my name. So the secretary says, so then he hears, I guess the Rebbe heard that as well. In the background, he hears the Rebbe again saying, Oy bazoi, if that's the case, then he should know that sometimes, azamol darf men reden zu sich. Sometimes you have to speak to yourself. That's what the Rebbe told him. You have to speak to yourself. He took this as a major life message, a major life lesson that he carried with him for the rest of his, for going forward. That sometimes you don't need to look outside; you can look inside. Speak to yourself. And he actually continued the story that many times when he encounters, has to make an important decision in his life, he will take out a book of the teachings of the Lubavitcher Rebbe on the Parsha, the Kutei Sichos, sit down, read a teaching of the Rebbe, and then figure out how to make the decision by talking to himself. Speak to yourself. So maybe that's what the Alter Rebbe means when he says, I have all the answers to all the questions. The book doesn't have it, you have it. You have it inside if you just speak to yourself and if you know how to speak to yourself. But that means you have to know yourself. And that's what the Tanya is going to teach us. Questions, comments so far? Okay. So that leads into the next, that was like the introduction to the introduction. So what I'd like to do now is share one of the major themes of the Tanya. That if you don't know this idea, it's going to be very, very difficult to understand pretty much anything in Tanya. I don't mean to understand each individual line, each individual sentence you could understand. But to understand what's going on, it's very difficult if you don't understand this major theme. And that is the first theme that's introduced in the Tanya in chapter 1, right at the beginning. Not actually the beginning of chapter 1, because that starts off with a couple detailed questions detailed questions that he doesn't start to answer until chapter 12, which, by the way, I found that I've met many people over the years that tell me they started to learn Tanya, but they just couldn't do it. And I find out the reason is very simple, because they started at the beginning, chapter 1. He asks all these questions, but there's no answers. And he just keeps going and going and going. It's very technical. And they never got to chapter 12 where he starts to answer them. 12, 13, 14 is only when he answers the questions in chapter 1. So I've met many people that get discouraged by that because they don't know. You just got to wait. Got to wait a little bit. It can be very hard to pick up where's he going with this. So while it's not nice to skip, so we're not going to skip, but we're going to sample the first major theme in the Tanya. And that is in chapter 1. And interestingly, what I'm calling the first major theme in the Tanya is not a chiddush of the Alter Rebbe at all. The Alter Rebbe, this is not his novelty. He didn't invent this. This is straight from Kabbalah. But the Alter Rebbe, and by the way, interestingly, that in the official name of the Tanya, why we call it the Tanya is maybe for another time, but the official name of the Tanya is Likutei Amarim, which just means a collection of sayings. Because in his great humility, he's kind of framing it like, I didn't even say anything new. I took a Gemara from here, and I took a Medrash from there, and I just kind of put it together, and it's a collection of sayings, which is not incorrect, but there's very much tremendous chidushim, tremendous novelties, a completely new way, a completely new approach in the Tanya. But in his humility, he says, I collected some things. So one of the things he collected is this teaching from the Arizal, which is as follows. It's al pi ma shekosav Reb Chaim Vital zal b'shara kedusha. It's based on what Reb Chaim Vital writes. Chaim Vital was the student, the main Talmud of the Arizal. He actually only learned by the Arizal for 2 years. The Arizal passed away, I think he was 37. Reb Chaim Vital, who wrote down his teachings, only studied by him for 2 years. So Reb Chaim Vital wrote as follows: "To l'chol ish Yisrael, for every single Jew, echad tzaddik ve'echad rasha, whether that person is righteous or not quite so righteous, yesh shtei neshamos. He has 2 souls, not one, but 2 souls. Dichsiv, how do you know? Where do you get that from? Well, the pasuk says, "V'neshamois ani asisi." I made souls, neshamois, in the plural. I made souls. Not just that you have a soul and you have a soul and you have a soul, but that each person has multiple souls, 2 of them. What are those 2 souls? Shein shtei nefashos, nefesh achas mitzad haklipa v'sitra achra. One of those souls is derived from a neutral level of non-holiness. I know we call it a soul. You think a soul is holy. Oh, it's a soul, it's probably holy. Well, not necessarily. This soul, which he doesn't name yet, but will name later, we'll call it the animal soul, or the nefesh habahamis. That's the term that's used later in Tanya and other places in Chassidus. The nefesh habahamis, the animal soul. And that is not holy. It's not bad. It's not evil. It's just not holy. And he says it's found in the person's blood. I don't know if that means that it's actually in your blood. If you get a blood test, it doesn't show that you have a soul in it. But it's, what is blood? Blood is representative of the physical vitality of a person. You see a person, you can see on their face that a person's alive because you see there's blood there, right? There's a life force coursing through them. So the blood is indicative of physical vitality. And that's really what this soul is all about. This soul, which he calls the animal soul, is an animal. It means that, no offense to anybody, but that you're an animal, which is true. We're animals. Human beings are also, okay, it's true. We're a little bit more elevated than your average animal. We have the capacity to feel and experience emotions, I think, in greater ways than animals can. We have the ability and the capacity to use our intellect to philosophize, to think about purpose, meaning, and things like that, which I don't think animals ask themselves when they wake up in the morning, why do I exist? What is my purpose? Animals just follow their instinct. So it's true, we are a loftier type of animal, but animals nevertheless. And that's because we have an animal soul. You could think of the animal soul, by the way, also perhaps as just a human soul. The animal soul means that you're alive. The animal soul means that you're a human being who lives and breathes and sleeps and experiences the physical world as the foremost reality in its life. That's the animal soul. The animal soul is a person's drive for self-preservation, which is pretty much the number one drive of every human being. I want to stay here. Right? A person wants to eat, to preserve themselves, and they want to procreate to continue, and which is also preservation of self. So that's the animal soul, really. It's typically selfish, not in a bad way. Just like if you're hungry, you probably want to make sure that you get some sushi at the smorgasbord, right? You want to make sure you get some if you're hungry. That's not bad. It's just thinking about yourself. That's very animalistic. That's very human. It's not bad. It's normal. It's not holy, though, that's for sure. The animal soul in general seeks pleasure. Pleasure means right here, right now, whatever's the most pleasurable thing with the least amount of effort, right now, that's what the animal soul typically wants to do and looks for. And he relates very much to the earthly, natural world. That's soul number one. But there's a second soul. You don't actually need it to be alive. The second soul is a bonus. It's extra. And it's called the godly soul, the nefesh ha'elokis, the godly soul. You don't need one to be a human. You don't need one to be alive. To be alive, all you need is an animal soul. Basic desire and for self-preservation and attraction and connection to the natural world. You'll be alive. You could live a wonderful, productive life without a godly soul. You just won't be Jewish. The godly soul is what makes a person Jewish. So it's really the exact opposite of the animal soul. Whereas the animal soul is selfish, self-preservation. It's about me. The godly soul is altruistic. Doesn't really think about himself so much. He thinks about Hashem, what Hashem wants. Whereas the animal soul is related, we said before, to the blood. The godly soul is related to the breath, which you can't really touch. It's intangible. You breathe in, you breathe out. Whereas the animal soul seeks pleasure, which doesn't have to be physical pleasure, by the way. The animal soul might derive pleasure through music. It's more ephemeral, it's more spiritual. Different types of pleasure, different types of animals. There's an ox, then there's a sheep. Sheep is more docile. Different types of animals. Different people have different types of animal souls. Whereas the animal soul seeks pleasure, the godly soul seeks godliness, seeks Hashem. Nothing to do with pleasure. It's not about pleasure. It's about Hashem. It's about God. And whereas the animal soul relates very much to the world, the godly soul relates to the transcendent, relates to what's above. So these are the two souls, the animal and the godly. And the rest of the Tanya is predicated upon this idea, and is based on this idea that we have two souls, and everything in our life pretty much comes down to the battle between these two souls. Because at any given moment, the Alter Rebbe will explain to us, we're faced with a question of what should I do next? What should I do now? Maybe I should have a glass of water. Maybe I should put a coin in the pushka. I don't know. It depends on what is the moment right now. But at any given moment in time, I have to choose what's my next move. What am I going to do now? Do I choose in accordance with my animal soul, or do I choose in accordance with my godly soul? My entire life comes down to that. And usually, it's not always the easiest choice, because the animal soul is an animal. He's tough. He or she is powerful. Again, some have an animal soul that's like an ox, raging out of control, powerful. Others are much more docile, calm, quiet.
Is it always clear? Because like you said, it could be that you derive pleasure from something more esoteric or spiritual.
That's a great question. Is it always clear which is coming from the animal and which is coming from the godly? Well, no, it's not always clear. And in fact, if you want to try to figure it out, for the next 24 hours, if you can, whenever you have a desire to do something, ask yourself, where did that come from? Did that come from my animal soul or my godly soul? We're not passing judgment, by the way. There's no right or wrong here. It's just to know, to try to identify, where did desire A that I have right now, where did it come from? From my godly soul or from my animal soul? Because it can only come from one at a time. So it's this conflict that makes up the bulk of the Tanya, and the bulk of the Alter Rebbe's teachings in the Tanya is how to address this conflict. He actually calls it, he calls it later, a milchama, a war. First of all, the animal soul has a big head start. Why is it a head start? Because you get him or her when you're born. Actually, even at the moment of conception, you get the soul. Certainly when you're born, for sure. But you don't really have the full godly soul yet at that time. That's why, what do babies do, basically? No offense to any babies around here, but they're kind of animals. They just like cry and sleep all day. That's like all they do. And children, what do children do? No offense to anybody's children, including my own. They're kind of like little animals, right? Like, it's only as a person gets older and matures. Part of the reason a person matures and is able to look at things with perspective, with maturity, is because their godly soul is slowly creeping in. The godly soul fully is present within a person at their bar or bas mitzvah. So you get 12, 13 years of a head start. The animal soul has 12, 13 years of a head start of training you to do what he wants you to do, rather than what you want to do, what you know you should do, what Hashem wants you to do. It's got a big head start. Number one, it's an animal. It's forceful, it's strong, it's powerful. Whereas the godly soul is like, can't we just learn some Gemara? The animal soul is like, what? But there's dinner. There's dinner right now, etc. And the other challenges that a person may have in life. So it's not always easy to identify where a specific desire comes from at any given moment. It's an experiment, a thought experiment you can do, is to ask yourself, where are my desires coming from at any given moment? So whereas I mentioned before, the Tanya, for the most part, if you want to know how to manage your anger, if that's something that you struggle with, or how to manage whatever challenge a person has, for the most part, there's no chapter addressing that particular issue in the Tanya, for the most, even though he does address particular issues, but it's not like, oh, if you want to know how to deal with anger, look in chapter 5. If you want to know how to deal with arrogance, that's chapter 6. There's nothing like that. Many of the other great works of Musar are built in that way. The Tanya is not built in that way. It's not dealing with the problems per se. What the Alter Rebbe strives to do is to delve into the root causes behind why I have all these problems. If I can get to the root, to the core, then I'm not just wrapping Band-Aids around. Band-Aid's great. Sometimes you need a Band-Aid. Okay. If you need it, so do it. But that's not going to solve the problem. It's just a Band-Aid. So the Alter Rebbe wants to delve and dig beneath the surface to find out, yeah, by the way, why do you have such and such desires? Why do you feel such and such feelings that are inappropriate, etc.? Why do you feel that way? Let's get to the core. There's an animal soul and a godly soul. That's why. That's where the cognitive dissonance that so many of us face comes from. Because there's a constant tension in, I don't know percentages, but I'm going to say 99% of us have this constant tension between the animal and the godly. And it's not bad. It's normal. So if you feel the tension, it means you're alive. It means you're normal. That's what it means. The tension is a good sign. So the Alter Rebbe in the Tanya is describing primarily our inner struggle and the inner workings of our soul. And by giving us insight into how my soul or souls work, I'll be able to find all the answers to all the questions, because I'll know how to address them. I'll know that rather than just addressing the problems or the symptoms, I'll know what's actually going on beneath the surface. So he depicts life as a battle. That's intense. Milchama, he uses the word. It's an intense battle for your whole life. He even later in the Tanya, he writes, maybe that's why you were created, to struggle. Maybe that's why you were created. We don't like to hear that, but that's what he says. But one thing that I find fascinating about it is that the struggle is not depicted in the Tanya as Yetzer Hara and Yetzer Tov. Now, we have a Yetzer Hara, we have an evil inclination, and we have a good inclination too. The Alter Rebbe is not disputing that. No one's disputing it. But that's not the struggle. That's not what he's addressing in the Tanya. Rather, the Alter Rebbe elevates the conversation. Rather than describing a struggle between good inclination and bad inclination. By the way, if you lose that struggle between the good inclination and the bad inclination, what have you become? You've become bad. Because you gave into your Yetzer Hara, your Yetzer Hara, the evil, horrible, terrible, bad inclination. So if a person, chas v'shalom, loses that struggle, which, hey, Might happen at some point. You've sunk into the Yetzer Hara. You've sunk into a level of Ra, of bad. So the Alter Rebbe elevates the conversation. It's not a struggle between good and bad per se. It's a struggle between animal and godly. That's the struggle. It's a completely different conversation. Because now, in my struggles of my life, even if I stumble, even if I fall, and I cave and give in to the desires of my animal soul, Nusa, what have I become? An animal. Okay, I was anyway an animal. Shkoyach, so you're like everybody else. I didn't become bad, because I'm not bad. At worst, I'm an animal, which is not so bad. What is an animal? An animal eats, drinks, sleeps, etc. Good. So are those things bad? Is it bad to eat? Is it bad to sleep? Are these things bad? Not at all. Not only that, they're necessary. You cannot live without them. So Mr. Godly Soul, or Rabbi or Rebbetzin Godly Soul, wants you to eat, needs you to eat, needs you to sleep. Because if you don't, you will not have many years on this earth. And then the godly soul won't have opportunities to do the godly things that he wants to do. So the conversation is elevated above good versus evil. It's been elevated to animal versus godly. So number one, if I lose the struggle, I've become a human, really. That's what I am. I'm a human. An animal, just a little bit elevated animal, right? A human, 1 second. But also another fundamental point is that what do you do with the animal? Well, let's take a step back. What do you do with the Yetzer Hara if you could? Annihilate, destroy, obliterate it. He ain't going to do nothing good for you, ever. In fact, the Yetzer Hara is always going to live up to his name. And he will always, without exception, do everything in his or her power to get you to do the worst possible thing at any given moment. So, for example, if you would offer Mr. Yetzer Hara a choice of 2 sandwiches, pastrami on rye, we're Jewish, so we can say pastrami on rye. One, glad kosher meat, pas Yisrael bread, everything, the highest standards of kashrus. The other sandwich, identical, pastrami on rye, but treif. Which sandwich will the Yetzer Hara choose if given the choice? The treif one, obviously. No, but they cost the same amount of money. They taste the same. They're equally delicious. Just have the kosher one instead. No. Yetzer Hara wants the treif sandwich because his goal is exclusively to get you to sin. And there's never an exception to that, unless he thinks that maybe there's a roundabout way to get you to sin better. Now, offer that same choice, by the way, to the animal soul. Mr. Animal Soul, kosher pastrami on rye, treif pastrami on rye, which one do you choose? I don't care. Just give it to me right now. Kosher is fine. Just give me, I'm hungry. So give it to me right now because I'm hungry. If you make me wait, I'll eat the treif one. But you want to give me the kosher one? No problem. Because the animal soul is not looking to get a Jew to sin. He doesn't care about Averas. He's not interested in that. I mean, unless it gets in the way of his pleasure, right? So if the only sandwich is a treif sandwich, he'll eat that, no problem. But that's not his goal. It's not what he's looking for. So with an animal, with a Yetzer Hara, the goal has to be to categorically wipe him off the face of the planet. Because he's not going to do anything good for you. We need total annihilation. But an animal, don't destroy the animal. Harness the animal. Put a yoke on the ox and plow the field. How are you going to do that without an ox? Are you going to plow? You pull the yoke yourself? It's not going to work. You're not very strong. You're just a little godly soul. You can't pull anything. You need the animal. The animal soul's power is not meant to be pushed away, ignored, or destroyed. Chas v'shalom. On the contrary, it's meant to be sublimated, harnessed, and utilized to serve the purposes of the godly soul. Yeah, that question is still relevant?
Yeah, so does that mean the Yetzer Hara is part of the second neshama?
Okay, so where do Yetzer Hara fit in exactly? They are basically drives within the respective souls.
Okay.
So there is a Yetzer Hara. And yeah, he's bad. He wants to get you to sin. But we can, in a certain sense, circumvent all of that, in a sense. Why struggle with good and evil? We could struggle with animal and godly. And then I don't need to annihilate anybody or anything. I just need to take my animal, harness my animal. What it really becomes is an issue of training. It's like raising children. You have little animals running around your house. If you let them, they'll destroy the place. Not because they're bad, just because that's what kids will do. And they'll test the limits also, right? Because they want to see how far are mommy and tati going to let me go? What are they going to let me do? And if they see, oh, that's how far I can go. Okay, I just learned how far I can push the limits. So that's parenting, right? We want to educate and train our children. No. This is not safe. This is okay. That's not okay. This is the standards in our family, et cetera, et cetera. Not because the kid is bad. The kid's not bad. They're a kid. What do you want from them? They just need to be trained. They need to be educated. So that's really the conversation of the Tanya, is you're not going to get rid of your animal soul. He's a part of you. So let's train him. Let's educate him. Chabad, Chochmah Bina Das. Let's use our mind to educate our animal soul that there are some things more important in life than your personal pleasure. There are some things that are more meaningful than your immediate enjoyment. And you could educate him and train him, just like a child loves candy. Some adults do also, but usually adults like more sophisticated foods, like wine. Give a glass of dry wine to a child. What is this? It's disgusting. And adults say, no, that's a good bottle of wine. As the person ages and matures, they appreciate different types of things. So we could also come in our life today, in 2025, we could come to appreciate and value a mitzvah. And I think that's why we're here. It's because we already do appreciate and value a mitzvah. But this spreads to every corner of our life. It becomes present in everything. All the answers to all the questions. What am I sensitive to? Because the animal soul is knocking at the door from the moment I wake up. From the moment I wake up, the animal soul is there. Go back to sleep, hit snooze, you're tired. I am tired, you're right. By the way, the animal soul also has chabad. He also has intellect. Smart person. He knows exactly what to say. You deserve to hit snooze at least 10 more times. He might be right. But that doesn't mean you should necessarily listen. And this is the tension of the Tanya. This is the tension that the Alter Rebbe presents. So it's really a process, and the whole Tanya is this process of education, of elevating our life to a higher conversation. And that I can strive higher. I can strive for that. Why do I have to talk about bad stuff? Why do I have to talk about Yetzer Hara? Forget the Yetzer Hara. Let's elevate my whole life. Let's elevate the entire conversation. And let's train and educate our inner animal, our Nefesh Bahamis. Because he's not against mitzvahs, not against Torah at all, chas v'shalom. It's just in those every little moments he's bugging you to give in to his animalistic desires. So that's really the going forward. The rest of the Tanya, we kind of just encapsulated here, sort of, chapters really 1 through 9. We kind of encapsulated those chapters just right now. I tried to, at least. The rest of the Tanya is going to try to teach us, first of all, when you have this battle of the animal soul and the godly soul, what are the possible outcomes? What are the possible results? Which way might it go? He's going to present 3 ways, chapters 10, 11, 12. And then, if we want to be guided by our godly soul, yet at the same time, the animal soul is always going to be hammering away, always going to be bugging me. He's not going to give up. Doesn't matter, I'm not going to give up. So I'm going to need some strategies to maintain a high level of performance. If you run a marathon, if you could do that, and then someone says, okay, now do it again. I can't maintain such a high level of performance. There's only so much koyach I have, spiritually too. So we can't get spiritually exhausted. We can't get emotionally exhausted. So the rest of the time is going to give me tools how to make it more manageable to stay in control of the animal soul. Comments, questions? Okay, so that is an introduction to the Tanya. To wrap up, the Alter Rebbe is trying to share with us how to serve Hashem with our heart. Rachmana liba boi. How do I serve Hashem for real? How do I personalize it? And the Alter Rebbe's approach is you got to use your mind, process of education, a process of training, a process of awareness and consciousness about Hashem, thinking about Hashem. Again, you can't love someone that you don't know. Or even if you find a way to, you'll love the person more as you get to know them more. And then, and the Tanya, rather than dealing with particular problems or the symptoms, if you will, approaches Avodas Hashem that we're going to go to the core issues. What is beneath the surface that's causing these issues? And everything really comes down to this battle between the animal soul and the godly soul. And we all have the power to educate, to train the animal soul that we have, that he or she should also be directed and plowing the fields for Hashem rather than for his own purpose and his own self. After the Alter Rebbe wrote the Tanya, it was originally published and not as a book quite like this. It's published in little pamphlets, and he sent some of them around to some of his chaverim, some of his friends. One went to Zusha of Anapoli, in the town of Anapoli, the great tzaddik of Zusha. Another went to, I think it was Levi Yitzchak Berditchev. And the pamphlets arrived in their respective homes. Oh, the Alter Rebbe, our dear friend, sent me something. I better read it. So they each in their respective homes, one in Anapoli, one in Berditchev, started reading the original form of the Tanya. And wow, oh my gosh. And Reb Zusha, sitting in his homes, I got to tell Levi Yitzchak about this. He didn't know. Nobody texted them. They each had it. I got to tell Rabbi Yitzchak about this. So Rabbi Yitzchak thought to himself in the middle of the night, I got to tell Rabbi Zusha about this book that Alter Rebbe wrote. They each got up and ran towards each other's homes and met somewhere in, I guess Anapoli was bigger, met somewhere in Anapoli. So when they met together, they realized they each came for the same reason. Der ganz Anapoli hat gebrannt. The entire Anapoli was burning on fire. So hopefully this introduction to the Tanya will be pique the curiosity, if it's not already piqued, and enhance hopefully an appreciation of Tanya. And we do have, God willing, coming up for anyone who's interested, a 4-part class where we'll continue from here and go, God willing, through all 53 chapters of the Tanya. The goal is to do that in 4 weeks. It's a little bit impossible, but that's going to be the goal anyway. Kind of in the same style as tonight, with kind of like trying to hit the major themes. So we're going to skip lots and lots and lots, but we're going to try to go from one theme. We already did the first theme, 2 souls, to the next theme, to the next theme. Because again, the Tanya is not just a book; it's a one-on-one media, one-on-one audience with the Alter Rebbe that is developing a pattern and a theme and a strategy to help us connect to Hashem. So, thanks everyone for coming, and thank you again to Mrs. Black for opening your home and for hosting.
Thank you.
If there's any questions or comments, feel free.
So I was wondering why wouldn't we want to have the Yitzhar? Because wouldn't that be the vehicle to give us the Chira and a Sfus for choosing the right thing?
Yeah, so that's a good question. The Alter Rebbe talks about this at the end of chapter 14. 14? What about that? So he gives a mashal from the Zohar. The Zohar says, and it's not 14, sorry. I'm losing track of where it is. In any event, the mashal is, the Zohar gives a mashal of a prostitute. That there's a king who wants to test his son, the prince, to test the son's loyalty to the kingship and the royal family. So the king, don't ask questions, this is what the Zohar says. The king decides to hire a prostitute and sends the prostitute to his son to try to seduce his son. He wants to test the son, so figures I'll give him the biggest test there could be. So sends the prostitute and hires the prostitute and says, do everything you can to seduce my son. She's like, but like you're the king and he's the prince. Sounds a little bit dicey. No, I'm hiring you, I'm paying you. This is what you need to do. Okay, it's hard to turn down a job offer from the king. So she says, okay, fine. But on the way, this is the Yitzhar. On the way, however, she decides it's a little too much for her to do this because she knows like what's going to happen if she's actually successful. That's not very good. So she passes on the job to her friend, who passes on the job to her friend, who passes on the job to her friend. So eventually, the one who actually comes to the prince she doesn't even know that it came from the king, and the king obviously wants her to fail. So she does everything full blast ahead to do a good job, if you will. That's really the Yitzhahara. But there's nothing good about that per se, other than the goal. Because again, even the Yitzhahara is coming originally from the king. So the goal is to access a greater strength. Obviously, not to cave, not to give it to the Yitzhahara, obviously, but to rise above the Yitzhahara. So the Yitzhahara is very much there, but there's really nothing redeeming about the Yitzhahara in and of itself. Right? Hashem places it there with the hopes that I'll rise above. Hopefully a person will rise above. But the Yitzhahara in and of itself, there's nothing redeeming there. If that made any sense.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Okay, in the creation story, the Vayipach Be'apav Nishmas Chaim is what soul? Because
That's a
Adam-
great question. So
Adam is
okay, that's a great
not
question.
Jewish.
Right. Okay, so let's explain the question. So first of all, you may or may not be referring to the quote in the Zohar at the beginning of Tanya. The Alter Rebbe quotes the Zohar, which no one has found this Zohar, just interestingly. So I don't know. The Alter Rebbe had a slightly different version, or maybe knew something that we didn't know. But it quotes the Zohar as saying that in the creation story, when Hashem, Vayipach ba'apav nishmas chaim, when he breathed into the nostril, that's why we get, remember I mentioned before, the animal soul is related to the blood, the godly soul is related to the breathing, right? That's Vayipach ba'apav. So Hashem, I don't know exactly the best way to translate it, but exhaled into Adam's nostrils a nishmas chaim, a soul, a life. So the question is, which soul is that? That's your question? Is that the godly soul or the animal soul?
As far as I'm concerned, Adam is mankind, not specific to the Jewish people, it's humanity.
Right. So the question is, if I understand correctly, was that just really an animal soul? Because Adam was not Jewish. Adam was not Jewish.
But it doesn't make sense that it's the animal soul if we're talking about it coming through the breath.
Oh, good. Exactly. So the Arizal explains that it was the godly soul. And even though Adam HaRishon is explained in Kabbalah as being a neshama klolos, so Adam HaRishon included all neshamos ever, which presumably includes Gentiles, Jews and Gentiles, presumably. However, the Arizal explains that actually at that point, at the point of creation, Adam HaRishon only included the souls of Jews because there were no Gentile souls at that time. They came about later. So at that point in time when God breathed in the soul into the nostrils of Adam HaRishon, that was the Nefesh Elokis, that was the godly soul. As far as the Gentiles, their souls didn't exist at that point. So that was exclusively the godly soul into Adam HaRishon, which was therefore also by extension to every Jewish soul as well. Does that answer the question? Not so much.
At what point, when was there another soul, like,
When did the Gentile souls come?
yeah,
If I recall correctly, and I could look it up because I remember where it is. It's somewhere in the Arizal. I think it says, I'm not going to say because I don't remember clearly. I'd have to look up where, but it is brought down at what point that happened. I'm not remembering clearly where it was, but Blina, I'll look it up and get back to you. Yes.
Is that saying that Adam HaRishon in a certain technical sense isn't a Gentile soul? He's a Jewish soul?
It's hard to say that Adam HaRishon was Jewish because he wasn't. It's also hard to say Adam Avinu was Jewish. What made him Jewish? He lived before there were Jewish people. He lived before Mount Sinai. Yet certainly we would never say that Avraham was not Jewish. Of course he was Jewish, the first Jew. So there it's more clear cut.
But Abraham was finding Hashem. Abraham's the one who, like, he lived with the king, like something like that, and then like.
Right, so he was
I know
Jewish or was
there's
not Jewish?
someone else that, like, I know there's another God. I know there's Hashem.
Right, so did he become Jewish or he was always Jewish? So what exactly happened over there?
Jewish with the first memo.
Oh, he became Jewish, so he wasn't Jewish. So it's complicated, in other words. He was Jewish, he wasn't Jewish, he became Jewish, he was always Jewish, he was the first Jew.
Right, but also how do you know, like, there was another? Like, he was looking for another, like, he knew that there was a Hashem, like, how did he?
How did Avram discover Hashem?
Right, like, he was looking and like he,
Well, first of all, regarding Adam Rishon, it's hard to say he was Jewish because he wasn't really Jewish. Certainly not the way, certainly not like Avram Avinu was Jewish. Right? Avram Avinu, everybody says, of course he was Jewish. What's the question? Who would say Avram Avinu wasn't Jewish? But Adam Rishon is in a sense beyond that. He's this Kabbalistic image, if you will, of humanity, which ultimately, and again, I have to look up where exactly, ultimately all souls derive from Adam Rishon. Right? When it says in also the creation story, right, that B'Tselem Elokim, that man is created in God's image, who's that talking about? Jews or Gentiles?
Humanity.
Everybody. Yeah. In fact, the Rebbe actually said that we should tell Gentiles, hey, you know what? You were created in the image of God. It says so in the Bible. We should tell that to Gentiles. They should know that they're also the image of God. They should learn to respect that and value how special they are. So, yet at the same time, we don't really say Adam Rishon was Jewish. Wasn't Jewish per se. It was kind of this all-encompassing thing, which again, at first, the souls were only Jewish. At some point later down the line, it came that all the souls were also included with Adam Rishon. Something like that. As far as how Avram Avinu discovered Hashem, I think we know the classic story, right? He looked around, he saw a place on fire, so to speak, and saw a whole world in chaos. Sounds familiar, right? And what, ain't nobody in charge over here? And he looked and searched, and that's in many ways why he's the first Jew. He was searching, he was looking, those are the people who came to the Alter Rebbe. People who were searching. There were people who already had found Yiddishkeit. They didn't need them. You should start keeping Shabbos. I'm keeping Shabbos already. It was people who, even though they were already in it, but they were searching, like Avram Avinu, searching for something more, something deeper, something more personal.
Can I ask one more question?
Of course, please.
If there are so many people in this world that just have what we're gonna call the animal soul, where is altruism coming from? Like, anybody who does something that's not benefiting themselves personally, it's not giving them pleasure. It's hard for me to understand how that could come from something, from a soul that's just interested in sustaining itself.
So, thank you. So this is being recorded, but I think that actually the real question in my mind is when it was. I'm not trying to make this personal, but when was the last time you did something altruistic? I don't mean you. I mean anybody here. When was the last time you did something that you can really say I was completely not for me, completely selfless? And the answer, probably, I'll answer for myself, is not so often. Not so often. Most of what I do during the day is because of myself. I'm drinking because I'm coughing. It's for myself. So that's a silly example. But I think that the whole idea of altruism in many ways is abnormal. We expect people to be selfish. Again, that's not necessarily bad. We expect people to look out for themselves. Don't you look out for yourself? Don't we want our friends and our loved ones to take care of themselves, to be selfish in a sense? Of course we do. Of course we want people to take care of themselves. So really, I think most people are acting in a self-direct, let's not call it selfish, because that does sound selfish. Let's call it a self-directed way. Most of us, most people in the world perhaps, the majority of the time, most things they do are self-directed. And I don't mean that as a critique. It's just what it means to be human. It's what it means to be alive. What the Nefesh HaElokis gives us is the ability to rise above ourselves. How does a human rise above himself? It's nearly impossible. Because by definition, I am me. By definition, I'm stuck in myself. I can't get out. I'm stuck. So I'm about myself. Of course I am. And I think that most people are doing things for themselves in some way. Even the what may be perceived or may seem altruistic in a person's life. I have a hunch that if you drill down and really get to the core, it does in some way come back to them. I'm going to be nice to you because I know then you're going to be nice to me. No, but right now I'm helping you and I'm serving you and I'm pandering to you, whatever it may be, to help you and totally selfishly, I'm giving you my dinner instead of me eating it. Sounds very selfless. But what's the real motivation? What's the real motivation for helping to heal the sick and for doing all sorts of wonderful, great things? Many people, I think, I'm not sure, I don't have statistics, but I think if we really drill down, we'll find out that in some way it does come back to the person, whether it's for their own self-fulfillment, that I was the one who discovered the cure for insert terrible disease here. I'll forever be known. It'll be named after me, the cure, et cetera, which, listen, halavai. Halavai person would find a cure for certain diseases and have it named after them. Let it be. Let it be that their motivation is so that their name should be on the building. Okay, great. You're going to support the yeshiva? Fantastic. Okay, so you're a little bit like to have your name in lights? So what? You're doing good deeds, you're helping people? Great. That's not bad. But the chiddush, I think, and again, this is just the way I understand it. So that self-directedness, that selfishness is normal. It's human. And many seemingly altruistic acts are not really so altruistic. But we have the ability to, yes, be completely altruistic. And that's only because of the Nefesh Elokis, because the Nefesh Elokis is not me. It's godly. It's Eibishter. It's a Kadosh Baruch Hu that gives me the ability to rise above myself, which in many ways, which partly is what the Alter is going to explain later, Asher Kiddishonu b'mitzvosav. Hashem sanctifies us with the mitzvahs. What does it mean, Kiddishonu, to sanctify? Kodesh means separate. Hashem gives me a mitzvah because a mitzvah is the vehicle by which I'm able to rise above myself. A mitzvah means it's not me. That's what a mitzvah is in many ways. It's not me. It's not what I want to do. It's what Hashem wants me to do. Okay, ultimately, of course, I hope I want to do it too. But a mitzvah means that at any given point in time that I have to do a mitzvah, it doesn't matter if I want to do it or not. It's irrelevant. It's irrelevant if I'm in the mood. It doesn't matter. If there's a certain mitzvah that needs to be done right now, and I do it, I'm rising above. That, in many ways, that is altruistic. That's rising above yourself. It's not about me. Which is why many times the greatest advice a person can be given is to do something for someone else. Stop, the focus on the self becomes so exhaustive that then you get even more stuck in the self. So that's just what I think. That most of us, the real question, when did I do something altruistic? When did I actually do something truly selfless? Yet I have the ability, because of my Nefesh Elokis, to yes, rise above and go beyond myself. That's just what I think.
I think in psychology, they debate if it even exists, altruism.
Oh, okay. That's the psychologists. Does modern day psychologists believe in altruism? I don't know.
What about a person's conscience? Where is that? Is that in the nefesh? Is that
What do you mean?
Is that in the animal soul? Like the
This is
animal
part of the
soul?
brilliance of the Tanya also we're going to see. That yes, and also in the godly soul. That each soul, this is I think part of the beauty also, we didn't get to this point, but rather than just being a yetzer, what's a yetzer? Yetzer is an inclination, like you're leaning one way. Okay, either you're leaning this way or you're leaning that. The discussion of the two souls is not about an inclination. It's not about which way you're leaning, which way you're inclined, so to speak. It's each soul is a complete unit in and of itself. Each soul has a full spiritual makeup with intellect, emotions, and everything that goes around, that goes with being a neshama. So where's the consciousness? In both. They each have their own separate consciousness. There's a bridge between them. That's a whole another discussion. But they each have their own consciousness. They each have their own intellect. They each have their own emotions and desires and pleasures. So it's in that sense that this discussion of the two souls is this like all-encompassing conversation.
But isn't it like a central idea in Yiddishkeit that you can take the base desires and elevate it, like just like eating a Suda can then become a mitzvah because you're doing it for the right intentions?
Sure, of course.
So wouldn't that be like a melding of both? It's not just the animalistic soul, but it's not necessarily altruism, it's somewhere kind of in between.
I don't know if eating the Shabbos Suda is altruistic. I don't know. It might depend. They say the story once I think it was by the Baal Shem Tov, once by Suda Shlishis. I'm getting mixed up the details a little bit, but the point will stand. He had all the Talmidim reach out and hold hands. Everybody closed their eyes, and they all held hands and they were singing and nigging. And then he told everybody to open their eyes, and they saw that there was someone they were eating the Shabbos food. He had a shtreimel, beautiful shtreimel, long bekisher, beautiful flowing beard, beautiful, very beautiful Shabbos attire, but it was an ox wearing the shtreimel. And he showed them by that just because you're having the Shabbos Suda and you're so holy, you're a behemoth. So even on Shabbos, I don't think when Chazal tell us there's a mitzvah of Oinik Shabbos, there's a mitzvah to have pleasure on Shabbos, mitzvah to have a Shabbos Suda. So should be an ox? That's what Chazal meant? The rabbis meant you should be a behemoth at the Shabbos table? I don't think so. I don't think that's what they meant. Yes, the mitzvah to have Shabbos delicacies and so forth for 100%. Just you don't have to be a behemoth. Even in that, you don't have to be an animal. But for sure, the Shabbos Suda in many ways is a great opportunity because it's in and of itself, it's a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah of Oinik Shabbos. So it's a mitzvah. On a Tuesday, there's no mitzvah of Oinik Shabbos on Tuesday.
I'm saying even on a Tuesday when you're eating lunch, you could say like this is for me
100%.
to have strength and do my vote.
Absolutely. And that's an attempt to take the animal and put the yoke on him and get him to plow your field for you and to harness that energy. So you're going to eat either way. And you have to eat. You need to eat. That's part of living. So I could choose, how am I going to eat? I'm going to eat like an animal, or am I going to eat like my God soul would want me to? Which obviously includes a bracha beforehand, a bracha afterwards. That's like starters. Make sure the food is kosher. It sounds silly, but like to make sure the food is kosher. All these things are all part of sanctifying the action and hopefully elevating it to a place where, yes, we get the animal soul and the God soul who are, they're in this, they're fighting. They're together no matter what you do. They're going to be there anyway. So to get them to work in tandem. And you can do it because, again, remember, the animal is like the small kid in your house. You just have to teach him where the boundaries are. You just have to teach him what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. It's training, it's education. So the Tanya is just going to tell us, hey, listen, go educate your animal, okay? Send him to school and educate him. That's the Tanya. Go educate your animal. Any other questions or comments, or maybe we should wrap up? Yeah, it's already late. Thank you again very much for hosting, and thank you everybody for joining.
Yeah.
L'chaim.